As a heavy rain blankets Fairmont Crest, this story unfolds as a chilling account of ambition, betrayal, and decisions that push people to the edge. Haley secretly accelerates a plan to chemically knock out Bill in exchange for a $10 million insurance policy. Randy is drawn into a vortex of complicity between fear and the will to survive, and Caroline, a beacon of principle, follows every blurred trail to unravel a ruthlessly calculated equation of evil. The writing delves into pent-up anger, moral cracks, and power struggles behind closed doors, where every click, every signature, every stray heartbeat can change the game. When money is defined as the only victory, who has the courage to redefine failure as a way to survive? And if justice is late, how long will buried truths lie dormant? The dark rain stretched like a murky curtain over Fairmont Crest, and beneath the damp eaves, everything moved in the hush of decisions that had already crossed a line. Haley walked with the breath of someone who knew she was attacking a fortress that would not easily fall, yet still forced herself to lay every risk on the table for a goal at once cold and obsessive, to turn Bill into a controllable memory, to turn his legacy into the resource with which she could rebuild life by the most selfish definition. She had told Randy not to share or to appeal to any scrap of mercy, but like a finger pressed to the pulse of reality, a confirmation that the chemical plan, a sequence of adjustments, dosages, timing, and camouflage, had arrived at its most perilous turn, where a man would collapse as if the old debts of his heart suddenly came to collect at once. There was no plea rising in her chest, only the dry growl of a long-banked rage, an emotion Bill had brushed aside with gestures that looked gentle but were full of calculation, a feeling she rehearsed every night like a ritual to justify herself. That he had pushed her to the far bank of reason, that betrayal was merely justice in another shape when a woman had no choices left. And so, before becoming a widow, she needed the $10 million insurance policy, needed every printed line that would certify a victory she refused to lose, and that compelled her down the most dangerous path, into the corporate heart of Bill's world, in search of the final blueprint he had hidden behind a maze of procedures, lock codes, and the habit of distrusting everyone but his own flawed instincts. Bill's office looked like a textbook photograph of confident power, dark wood gleaming like the surface of water at night, light glinting off framed images of triumphant moments, and at the center of it all, the computer was the only door, cold, unfeeling, and yet able to open onto a chain of events from which there would be no return. Haley set a steady hand on the trackpad, and let her eyes sweep the folder tree like a diver counting beats before sinking to the bottom. She knew Caroline appeared often like the shadow of propriety and order. That woman possessed the kind of steadiness Haley despised but respected, because that steadiness threw a bright beam over every secret and forced explanations out into words too feeble to outweigh the truth. But time afforded no lingering, and Caroline's presence, like a wall, accidentally became the impetus for Haley to accelerate. The hallway light slanted under the door, reminding her of danger's nearness, of footsteps that could arrive at any moment, of a latch that might snap open without warning. But in Haley's mind, alarm and resolve braided together like the dull ache between storms. She began to copy, to pierce the financial directories, to test the files with names so ordinary they were suspicious, peeling layers, shifting angles, hunting the traces a careful man like Bill left to mislead even himself on chaotic days. And then Caroline materialized, not by making noise but with a field of presence that thickened the air, that made Haley's every motion look naked, like an intruder pressing a palm to a victim's chest to measure breath. This moment was not made for senseless stubbornness, it demanded the speed of someone who had discarded guilt and kept only one criterion: to survive, to prevail, and to bolt the past behind a door pried out of shape. Haley knew exactly what Caroline saw in her eyes, not just the panic of being caught in the act, but the irreversible shift of a plan prepared with a thoroughness that verged on the obscene. And in that instant, what rose in Haley was not collapse but a state beyond the threshold, where she recognized that every retreat had already been burned, that Caroline would not stop until she hauled down the whole curtain, exposing every detail under the stark light of rules in which Haley no longer believed. So she chose the only option: push faster, push harder, push to the brink, because the suspected always fail before the aggressor who acts first, and half a step ahead is enough to switch roles on the board. From there, everything moved like gears newly oiled with desperation. Haley left the office before the access logs could roll into any report, but her haste did not fog her sight. She memorized every path, the server addresses, the names of the system administrators, and even Bill's habit of changing passwords after every major argument, small details no outsider would notice but that, for her, were conduits toward an invisible safe. She knew Randy was horrified by the new tempo, yet in that horror lived a curious thrill of someone standing on the lip of a chasm, peering into a black emptiness and recognizing that free fall is sometimes the only way to evade a hunter. Randy became both a lever and a mirror, so that Haley could see herself no longer as the thrifty, long-suffering woman kneeling through counterfeit evenings of peace, but as someone carrying fire in her hands, ready to burn the path if she had to. But the faster she ran, the more she was drawn into the friction of questions she had always brushed aside. Why 10 million mattered when the idea of freedom could be dearer than any number, why revenge tasted so sweet that her tongue went numb, and why Bill's silhouette appeared whenever she neared the goal, like the reflexive jerk of a driver teasing the wheel before the final swerve. Across town, Caroline shut a door with hands still trembling from anger wrapped in professionalism. She could not stand anyone turning morality into an excuse to attack, and she could not accept her own powerlessness watching a dark design slide past her eyes without sufficient proof to stop it. Deepest in her was the coolness of someone who had seen too many collapses born of money and glory, and in that depth, anger thickened into resentment toward what she hated most, the feeling of being replaced, of watching the values she protected fall out of fashion in rooms where power and intrigue were the only legal tender. Caroline understood that a frontal assault would only help Haley bolt away and erase her tracks. The only choice was to strike at the one place the woman had not had time to fence, the insurance transactions, the addenda updates, the internal emails whose patterns an outsider would never guess. She began to string together irregular interactions between Bill and the insurer, half-finished tweaks in medical files that only the practiced eye would notice, a diagnostic nearly complete but deferred without reason, a request to close an old case and open a new one to restructure payout terms. The picture slowly focused into a detour's path, and at the center stood Haley. Not as an impatient gambler, but as someone who had studied the rules long enough to know when breaking them would draw the least attention. Meanwhile, Bill still stood unknowingly at the brink, a man who seemed to have conquered every storm but was living by assumption somebody else had slipped into his notebook. He was accustomed to managing his health the way he managed balance sheets, and never considered that the strange responses in his body might come from the most familiar hand, never imagined those sleepless nights, those mornings of metallic bitterness, those sudden clamps on his heart were preludes to a frigid chemical game. The vision of him crumpling on the warm-lit living room floor, everything unfolding like a perfect equation, made Haley shiver at the magnitude of what she held, yet it also weighted her lungs as if with stone, because even a perpetrator must face the oldest question: what comes after victory, what comes after 10 million, what comes after a paper naming her a widow? The question did not stay her hand, but it did etch a brownish crescent of exhaustion beneath her eyes, a herald of another sleepless night. Caroline filed an internal report at a time that made no noise, careful not to trigger the defense system of the very person she was watching. She saw herself reflected in the room's frosted glass, a slim shadow, resolute and worn out, as if she had lived through multiple wars without being given time to name them. In the deepest chamber of her heart, stories of loyalty and fairness still flickered, but the summit of loyalty now was not standing firm on old promises, it was accepting the solitude of a gatekeeper, someone who believed that if she let go tonight, there would be no gate for anyone tomorrow. She knew she was stepping into a tangle that could sweep her away. She knew Haley would not yield when forced against a wall. She knew that no matter how tough Bill was, he would not wake in time to grasp who held the rope. On the far side, Haley tightened her appointments and calibrated dosages according to a schedule so regular it chilled the blood, turning Bill's habits into a quiet transport route for her scheme. She counted the body's responses the way an engineer measures the vibrations of a bridge before the gale, analyzed each shift to ensure the decisive moment would occur inside a sealed frame. She pushed Randy into a slot that frightened him but drew him in, a position where every step carried the stamp of complicity, where every blink brushed the brink like a curse. Randy began to feel the moral silt stir in his chest, yet the more frightened he became, the less he could flee, because the rope had become routine, and routine hid beneath the garments called love, salvation, no way back. Even on nights he imagined Haley stopping, his hands trembled with the opposite thought. If she stopped, everything would collapse. If she backed away, everything they had done would crystallize into evidence against them, and then he would be ground between the mill of justice and the grindstone of public scorn. Fear tied him to her more tightly than any other force, and that fear gradually transformed him into the tool she needed, smooth, punctual, unasking. On a day that turned clear as if to trick the nerves, Haley returned to the office with a plan to alter the insurance structure, disguised as a procedural update a diligent assistant could approve by accident. She knew Caroline would not be absent. That woman understood an attacker's tactics too well to grant any safe gap. Only this time, Haley had come not to rummage, but to modify variables at the surface, so that, if audited, everything would look as proper as round stamps bled through 1,000 files. Each click of her mouse was cold as mercury, sluicing into the financial arteries, sealing defects her own plan had opened, so that when Bill's heart misfired, the rest would proceed along a predicted track. Neither too fast to arouse suspicion nor too slow to ruin the job. Caroline stood in the doorway, asking nothing and needing no question, because the silence between two women now was its own language, a reminder that the war had exceeded the limits of explanation. Caroline's gaze was drawn tight like steel wire, and Haley set her palm on the tabletop, feeling the cool wood like the ice flat she had climbed onto long ago. A new fury detonated in Haley's chest, not at Bill or fate, but at the woman who dared step into the center of the drama, to try to pull the main breaker just as the stage lights reached their blaze. She imagined Caroline tripping over her own righteousness, imagined the moment the insurer verified validity and money ran through the channels she had drawn, imagined Bill dwindling into stunned eyes that had believed men like him could not fall. But beyond those images, a thin and tightening whisper asked what she would do if Caroline yanked some hidden knot from the snarl, if a single procedure skewed by a hair, if an unknown clerk at the insurer asked a question on the wrong day, if Bill's stubborn heart chose a deviant beat that set her equation askew. Those ifs buzzed around her temples like a black swarm. She hated them, yet knew they kept her sharp, forbidding even a moment's slack. Night fell, and Randy stood alone before the bathroom mirror, yellowed light washing a face that looked hastily carved, distorted by angles out of place. He thought about tomorrow, about his role as the keeper of the back door, about the numbers that would be sent off like paperwork mishaps, about the emergency call that would arrive just late enough, about the medicine pouch no one would touch except for fingerprints too familiar. But as he tried to soothe himself with steps Haley had programmed, a different anger overturned the table, anger at himself for stumbling into a territory where every value he had learned now sounded like bedtime stories. Why didn't he run? Why didn't he barge into Caroline's office and rip the veil of silence? Why was he still here drying his face with a frayed towel and whispering that tomorrow everything would be fine, that after tomorrow everything would be fine forever? He recognized the lie as a sugar-coated pill he had swallowed who knows when. In a slack moment, he saw a future where Haley stood on the balcony of some other place, watching rain on the sidewalk of some other city, eyes vacant, hands empty, and he was not there. The image frightened him more than the thought of being caught, because it stripped down the truth. He was not a partner, he was a temporary piece, and this game had been authored by a single mind. Bitterness condensed in his throat until he wanted to howl, but the bathroom was fortress still. He dried his face and returned to the route like a soldier hearing reveille. Caroline drafted an email she didn't send, a report she didn't file, because she knew that misplacing the timing was setting a trap for herself. She needed one more link, one datum bare enough to stand on its own against skepticism. She sifted through Bill's medical appointments, scanned the odd prescriptions, found a test halted at 90% without clear cause, found an addendum request in the insurer's annex signed in the wrong place and corrected in a different ink, found a meeting with a toxicology specialist that had been switched to a nutrition consult at the last minute. Each discovery fell like rain into a lake, widening rings unevenly. In their overlap she touched an instinct, a hand had arranged this. But instinct was not evidence. She stared through the glass and asked the questions every guard asks at the darkest hour. Was she saving a man, or was she saving her own identity as a fighter, Did her anger come from justice, or from the humiliation of being made an unwilling audience to a moral farce? Would her intervention turn her into the very piece Haley needed to legitimize the scheme? She closed her eyes, set a hand to her chest, and listened to her heart as if gauging the cadence of a troop crossing a bridge. Was the span trembling, was the rhythm even, and if she heard a crack, would she run or wedge herself there? The answer flashed cold: she would wedge there even if crushed, because if she backed away, everything she had believed would turn to scrap. That thought steadied her fingers as she typed the final line into the internal file, unsent but chambered like a round. In morning light bleached white by the hospital, Bill felt an artificial wellness, as if his body had chosen to grant him a day of calm to deceive the storm beyond. He passed corridors where people spoke of successful surgeries, improving charts, restoration of influence, and he bathed himself in the illusion that fortune kept following those who could calculate. In his heart, a small anger at some invisible disorder still burned, but he brushed it aside, for men like him were used to tamping fires with work, plans, calls. And yet behind him Haley laid each stone on a road of no return. Caroline wound the mainspring for the trigger hour. Randy trembled at the crossroads of cowardice and survival. It was a stage with scenery perfectly set, waiting only for an actor to fall so that applause could erupt, the applause of the unseen, of fate, of a choreography of ruin written in hatred and intoxication with power. Even Haley, who was certain she held the script, began to fear not failure but success. If money arrived, if the widow's certificate lay in a drawer, if everything looked clean as designed, would she sleep on any night knowing she had touched the final beat of a heart? Would she become a shadow pacing a new house, decorated with expensive, soulless pictures? Would the days after become a desert where she could not find a drop of sweetness to rinse the metallic bite of guilt? The self-interrogation made her irritable. She despised her own softness at the wrong time, so she scraped the thought away, raised another wall in her head, and pasted to it a to-do list like an addict building another basement to hide the last bottle. The second hand felt indifferent but flayed the skin, and across Fairmont Crest, people who seemed unrelated began to sense the odd weather. Security switched shifts earlier than usual, office staff saw a wave of emails testing the alarm system, night nurses received orders to update emergency intake protocols. Threads that did not know one another fused into a net. Haley looked at the net and saw victory. Caroline looked at the net and saw opportunity. Randy looked at the net and saw a noose. At the center, Bill walked like a man about to speak before a crowd, not knowing that his speech had been rewritten by an invisible hand. The cut point could arrive anywhere, in the office or at home, before the last call or after it, with witnesses or with only a silent room. Only Haley held the probability, and even she could not know every variable named human. Could Caroline find the missing piece in time when she flipped through files and found an extra ink press on a signature, a duplicate contract stored in a non-standard directory? Would Randy's spine snap under the weight of conscience and send him sprinting down a long hallway to break from the plan at the final minute? Would Bill catch a petty mistake in the medication schedule, grow suspicious, and call Caroline instead of going home? Or would his tightening heart betray him with a fatal clench at the moment nobody expected? If one link lagged by half a beat, the color of the game would change. Who would be forced to unmask first? When money had become the definition of victory, who had the courage to redefine defeat as a way to live? If justice did not arrive in time, could a buried truth sleep for long? And when the din faded, which rage would burn long enough to warm someone who had already turned to ash?